She stood at the window of Thornwood Hall, watching her husband's black horse disappear into the morning mist. He had not turned back. He had not said goodbye. He never did. Behind her, the maids exchanged quiet glances, and the silence they left behind was heavier than any words. Lady Seraphina Ashworth pressed her palm against the cold glass and let the familiar ache settle deep in her chest. 1 year of marriage, and she was still invisible. The wedding had been a political arrangement, meant to unite two families that had feuded for generations. The Duke of Thornwood, Caelan Ashworth, had agreed to the match with ice in his veins. He had looked at her on their wedding day not as a bride, but as a transaction. Seraphina had hoped, with the foolish optimism of a young woman raised on old poetry, that time and proximity might soften his heart. She had been wrong. In the early months she had tried everything. She learned his favorite dishes and instructed the cook. She placed fresh flowers in his study. She wore the colors he once mentioned preferring, a soft sage green that brought out the warmth in her hazel eyes. She waited in the drawing room each evening, hoping he might join her for tea. He never did. His footsteps would echo down the corridor, past her door, and fade into the wing of the house where she was not welcome. The servants were not cruel, but they were perceptive. They saw a duchess who dined alone, who walked the gardens without a companion, who received no letters from her husband when he traveled. Pity clung to her like a second skin. Seraphina learned to smile through it, to carry herself with a dignity she did not feel. But at night, when the vast bedchamber swallowed her in shadow, she allowed herself a few silent tears before sleep. One particular evening, 3 months after the wedding, hope flickered. Caelan returned from London earlier than expected. Seraphina was in the library, a book open in her lap when the door swung open. He stood there, tall and severe in his dark riding coat, his black hair damp from rain. His gray eyes found hers, and for a single heartbeat, something softened in his expression. "You are still awake," he said. "I could not sleep," she answered softly. He stepped inside and her heart stumbled. He rarely entered any room she occupied. He moved toward the hearth, holding his hands to the fire. She watched the tension in his shoulders, the way he seemed to be fighting some internal battle. Then he turned and his gaze drifted to the book in her lap. "You read poetry," he observed, a note of surprise in his voice. "It comforts me," she said. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he crossed the room and stood before her chair. She barely breathed. He reached down, and for a dizzying instant she thought he might touch her hand. His fingers hovered inches from hers. The air between them hummed with something unspoken. But then, as if catching himself, he pulled back. His face shuddered once more. "You should rest," he said, his voice flat. And then he was gone, leaving her with the ghost of a touch that never came. That night Seraphina allowed herself to hope. Perhaps the ice was beginning to crack. Perhaps he was simply a man who did not know how to express warmth. She clung to that hope for weeks, reinterpreting every glance, every brief word as a sign. She began to believe that if she just loved him enough, he would eventually love her back. The breaking point came in late autumn, at a dinner party hosted in Thornwood Hall to welcome a visiting noble family. Seraphina had spent days preparing the menu, arranging the floral displays, ensuring every detail reflected well on her husband. She wore a gown of deep burgundy silk that brought color to her cheeks, and for the first time in months, she felt a flutter of anticipation. Perhaps tonight, in the presence of guests, he would acknowledge her as his duchess. Perhaps he would offer her his arm, or seat her beside him, or even glance at her with something other than cool indifference. The guests arrived, and the evening began pleasantly. Seraphina moved through the drawing room with practiced grace, greeting each arrival, but her husband did not join her. He stood at the far end of the room, deep in conversation with Lady Marguerite Ashby, the daughter of an earl, and the woman everyone had once expected him to marry. Lady Marguerite was everything Seraphina was not: tall, fair-haired, with an easy laugh and a confidence born from a lifetime of privilege. She touched Caelan's arm as she spoke, and he did not pull away. Seraphina felt the stares of the other guests before she heard the whispers. Lady Marguerite had arrived uninvited, Yet the Duke had welcomed her warmly, too warmly. The message was unmistakable. The Duchess of Thornwood was merely a title. The woman who held the Duke's attention was someone else entirely. At dinner, Serafina was seated at the opposite end of the long table, far from her husband. She ate in silence, her food tasteless, while Kaelin and Lady Marguerite exchanged remarks and quiet laughter. No one spoke to Serafina beyond hollow pleasantries. She was a ghost at her own table. The pain was so acute it became physical, a sharp ache behind her ribs that made it difficult to draw breath. When the meal ended, Serafina excused herself early. She walked through the corridor with measured steps, her head held high, refusing to let anyone see her crumble. But once inside her bedchamber, she pressed her fist against her mouth and wept until there was nothing left. The hope she had nurtured for a year shriveled and died. She realized then that she had been waiting for love that would never come, and something inside her shifted. The following morning, Serafina rose with a new resolve. She would no longer orbit around a man who refused to see her. She would not waste another day yearning for affection that was not hers to have. If she was to be invisible, then she would become invisible on her own terms. She would fill her days with purpose, not pinning. She began with the estate. Thornwood was a vast holding, and while Kaelin managed the business and political aspects, the welfare of the tenants had long been neglected. Serafina, who had grown up watching her mother tend to the sick and the poor in their own small parish, knew what to do. She gathered the household ledgers, studied the accounts, and identified where help was most needed. She organized the delivery of firewood and blankets to families before the first frost. She visited the cottages herself, sitting with the elderly, listening to their stories and learning their names. At first, the tenants were wary. A duchess did not typically kneel in the dirt to examine a child's feverish brow or carry a basket of bread through the mud. But Serafina's kindness was not performative. It was real. She returned week after week, and slowly the villagers began to trust her. They started calling her Our Lady with genuine warmth. The nickname spread, and soon even the servants in Thornwood Hall began to regard her differently. The pity that had once shadowed their eyes was replaced by respect. Serafina also turned her attention to the children of the estate. There was no proper school, so she transformed an abandoned cottage into a small classroom. She taught reading, writing, and simple sums. The children adored her. Their laughter, bright and unfiltered, became a balm for her wounded heart. For hours at a time, she forgot she was a neglected wife. She was simply Miss Sira, the woman who brought books and biscuits and never raised her voice. It was during one of these afternoons that she met Dr. Silas Wren. He was a young physician, newly arrived in the county, with kind brown eyes and a gentle manner. He had heard about the Duchess's work and came to offer his medical assistance. Serafina accepted gladly. Together, they organized a small infirmary in the village, stocked with basic remedies and clean bandages. Dr. Wren treated the sick, and Serafina assisted, learning to clean wounds and brew herbal tonics. Dr. Wren admired her. It was clear in the way he looked at her, in the way he sought her opinion and listened intently to her thoughts. He did not treat her as an ornament or a political tool. He saw her intelligence, her compassion, her quiet strength. Serafina, who had been starved of genuine regard, found herself looking forward to their conversations. There was no impropriety, only a growing friendship that nourished something inside her that had nearly withered away. Kaelan, meanwhile, was oblivious. He had been consumed by estate matters and his own brooding nature, but soon small changes in his household began to prick his awareness. Serafina was no longer waiting in the drawing room when he returned. She no longer arranged flowers in his study or instructed the cook on his preferences. The house felt different. Quieter, perhaps, emptier. He noticed the absence of her presence in the corridors, the way the servants no longer mentioned her grace with that old note of pity. Something had shifted. One evening, he arrived home earlier than expected and found the main hall unusually still. He wandered through the rooms, a faint unease settling over him. In the east wing, he encountered his steward, Mr. Hargrove, who was carrying a stack of ledgers. "Where is the Duchess?" Kalen asked, surprising himself. He rarely inquired about her whereabouts. Mr. Hargrove looked up, and a glint of approval crossed his weathered face. "Her Grace is in the village, your lordship. She's been overseeing the new schoolroom. The children have taken to her remarkably well." Kalen frowned. "Schoolroom?" "Yes, my lord. She's been rather busy these past months. She's also organized a clinic with that young doctor, Mr. Wren. The tenants speak very highly of her." Something sharp twisted in Kaelan's chest. He had not authorized any of this. He had not even known. He dismissed the steward and retreated to his study, but he could not concentrate. The image of Seraphina, busy and purposeful, collided uncomfortably with the memory of the woman who used to wait for him with hopeful eyes. That woman was gone. A few days later, Kaelan decided to see for himself. He rode to the village in the late afternoon, keeping to the outskirts so as not to draw attention. The schoolroom cottage was easy to find. The sound of children's voices floated through its open windows. He dismounted and stood in the shadow of a large oak tree, watching. Seraphina sat on a low stool, a book open on her lap, surrounded by a dozen eager little faces. She was laughing. The sound struck him like a physical blow. He had never heard her laugh like that, free and light, without the weight of unspoken sorrow. Her hair, which she had always kept meticulously pinned in his presence, was loosely gathered at her nape, with soft tendrils escaping around her temples. She wore a simple gray gown, practical and plain, but she looked more alive than he had ever seen her. Beside her stood a man, young, sandy-haired, with an easy smile, Dr. Wren. He handed Seraphina a slate and said something that made her laugh again. The doctor's gaze lingered on her with unmistakable admiration. Kaelan's jaw tightened. A surge of something hot and possessive rose in his throat. He had no right to feel it, he knew that. He had ignored her for a year. He had let her dine alone, sleep alone, exist in the margins of his life. And yet, seeing another man look at her with such open warmth ignited a fire he did not know he possessed. He turned away sharply and rode back to Thornwood Hall. But the image of her laughter and the doctor's attentive posture stayed with him long into the night. The first crack in Kaelan's icy composure appeared a week later. A letter arrived from London summoning him to urgent business. He was set to leave the following morning. That evening he found Seraphina in the library, a familiar scene that now carried a different weight. She was not waiting for him. She was simply reading, a faint smile on her lips as she turned a page. He stood in the doorway watching her. She must have sensed his presence because she looked up. The smile faded, replaced by a calm, neutral expression. There was no hope in her eyes, no desperate longing, just polite acknowledgement. "I'm leaving for London tomorrow," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "I wish you a safe journey," she replied, and returned to her book. The indifference in her tone unsettled him more than any tears could have. He stepped further into the room. "You've been busy in the village." "Yes," she said simply. "The children have made wonderful progress." "You did not ask my permission." She closed the book and met his gaze steadily. "You have never shown interest in my activities. I did not think you would mind." The words were not accusatory. They were merely true, and that truth stung more than any reprimand. He had no response. He stood there, a duke with vast lands and power, utterly disarmed by a woman he had treated as invisible. She stood, tucking the book under her arm. "If there's nothing else, I'll bid you good night." He watched her walk away, the quiet click of the door marking a distance far greater than the length of the room. During his time in London, Kaelan found himself distracted. Business negotiations felt tedious. Social engagements grated on his nerves. He thought of Thornwood Hall, of the empty corridors, of Seraphina's calm face. He thought of Dr. Wren's admiring smile. The jealousy that had flared in the village returned with a vengeance, twisting into something darker, fear. He had never considered the possibility that she might not be his. The marriage contract bound her to him legally, but the law could not bind her heart. He had assumed, arrogantly, that her love was an entitlement he could claim whenever he chose. But he had waited too long. She had stopped offering it. And now another man, a kind and decent man, was standing in the space Kaelan had left empty. He returned to Thornwood earlier than planned. The moment he stepped through the doors, he searched for her. He found her in the garden, kneeling beside a rose bush, her hands covered in soil. Dr. Wren was with her, demonstrating how to prune a damaged stem. Their heads were close together, and Seraphina was listening intently. The sight sent a lance of pure anguish through Kaelan's chest. He strode toward them, his boots crunching on the gravel. Seraphina looked up, and for a fleeting instant he saw a flicker of surprise, but it was quickly masked. "Your Grace," she said, rising, "you returned early." "I did." His tone was clipped. He turned to the doctor. "Dr. Wren, I trust the village clinic is not suffering from your absence here." The doctor straightened, his expression polite but guarded. "Her Grace asked for assistance with the roses. I was happy to oblige." Kaelan's gaze flicked to Seraphina. "I would speak with you privately." She inclined her head, calm and unruffled, and bid Dr. Wren a warm goodbye. The easy familiarity of their farewell scraped at Kaelan's composure. Once the doctor was gone, Seraphina walked toward a stone bench and sat down, folding her hands in her lap. "What is it you wish to discuss?" He remained standing, his fists clenched at his sides. "Your association with that man is becoming a topic of conversation." Seraphina's expression did not change. "Dr. Wren is a friend. He has been kind to me when few others have." The words were a quiet blow. Kaelan felt the sting of his own neglect reflected back at him. "You are my wife," he said, his voice low. "Your reputation is tied to mine." "I am aware of my position," she said, and there was a new steel beneath her gentle tone. "But I have done nothing improper. I have merely found purpose because I could not find it within these walls." He took a step closer, his gray eyes burning with emotion he could not name. "Purpose." She met his gaze without flinching. "Yes, I am no longer the woman who waited for you to notice me. I filled my days with hope once, but hope is a poor companion when it is never returned. So I chose to live. I help the tenants. I teach the children. I have built something meaningful. I will not apologize for that." Her words hung in the air between them. Kaelan felt the ground shift beneath his feet. This was not the timid bride he had married. This was a woman who had quietly, resolutely stopped needing him, and the realization terrified him. He stepped back, his mind spinning. "I see," he managed, though he saw nothing clearly except the growing chasm he had created. That night he did not sleep. He paced his study, haunted by Seraphina's calm dignity. He remembered the early days of their marriage, the flowers in his study, the hopeful glances, the silent dinners where she had waited for a crumb of affection. He had dismissed it all. He had been cruel not with cruelty but with indifference. And now she had built a life that did not include him. The thought was unbearable. The following afternoon, fate delivered the first of two truths that would shatter him. While searching for a missing land deed in the estate archives, Mr. Hargrove brought him a bundle of old letters tied with a faded ribbon. They were correspondence between Kaelan's late father and Seraphina's father, Lord Harcourt. "I thought you should see these, Your Grace," the steward said gently. "I came across them in the old chest. They concern the circumstances of the marriage." Kaelan untied the ribbon with unsteady hands. He read through the letters slowly, and with each passing word, the foundation of his resentment crumbled. He had been raised to believe that the Harcourt family had betrayed his own, that their treachery had led to his mother's early death. The feud had been part of his identity. It was why he had agreed to marry Seraphina, to keep his enemy close, to exact a quiet, lifelong penance from her bloodline. But the letters told a different story. Lord Harcourt had been a loyal friend. He had tried to warn Kaylen's father about a dangerous business scheme, had even offered financial help to save Thornwood from ruin. The tragedy that followed, his mother's illness, the debts, the bitterness, was not caused by the Harcourts. It was his own father's pride and poor choices. The feud was a lie, a fabrication to bury shame. Kaylen's hands trembled. He had married an innocent woman, treated her coldly for a sin her family never committed. He had punished her for a ghost. The guilt was a physical weight, crushing his chest. But there was more. In the same chest, buried beneath the letters, was a small wooden box. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, lay a thin silver chain with a tiny pendant, a pressed forget-me-not flower sealed in glass, and beside it a scrap of paper in a childish hand. "I promise." Memory crashed over him like a wave. He was 8 years old again, lost in the vast woods that bordered Thornwood. He had wandered too far, frightened and alone, until a little girl with hazel eyes and tangled brown hair found him. She had taken his hand and led him back to the path. He had been so grateful that he had plucked a forget-me-not from the undergrowth and pressed it into her palm, declaring with all the solemnity a boy could muster, "I promise I'll marry you one day. I'll never let you be lost again." She had smiled, a gap-toothed smile, and tucked the flower into her pocket. He had forgotten. The years and the lies had buried the memory so deep he had not recognized her when she came to him as a bride. But Seraphina had remembered. She had kept the flower, had worn it around her neck on their wedding day beneath her gown, a secret talisman of a promise he had broken before he even knew her. Kaylen sank into his chair, the pendant clutched in his fist. The room blurred. He had been given a chance to love her from the very beginning, and he had squandered it. He had looked past the girl who had saved him, the woman who had waited, the wife who had hoped. He had been blind and cruel, and now she was slipping away. The next day, he sought her out with a desperation that bordered on panic. He found her in the small cottage she used as a classroom, alone, tidying the bookshelves. She turned when she heard his footsteps, and her expression was guarded. "I need to speak with you," he said, his voice hoarse. "Is something wrong?" He crossed the room and stopped before her, so close he could see the faint flecks of gold in her eyes. "Everything is wrong. I was wrong, about your family, about you." She stiffened. "What do you mean?" He told her about the letters, the truth of the feud, the innocence of her father. He watched the emotions flicker across her face, surprise, sorrow, a flash of anger. But she did not speak. She simply listened, her hands still at her sides. When he finished, she said quietly, "You married me to punish my family." "Yes," the admission tore out of him. "And I was a fool, a prideful, blind fool. I have wronged you in ways I can never undo, I know that." Seraphina looked away, her jaw tight. "Understanding your reasons does not erase the pain, Kaylen. It does not change the year I spent alone, invisible." He reached for her hand, and she let him take it, though her fingers remained limp. "I know, I have no right to ask for your forgiveness, but there is something else." He withdrew the silver chain from his pocket and held it up, the forget-me-not pendant catching the light. Her breath hitched, her eyes widened, and her composure shattered for the first time. "Where did you find that?" "In the old chest, with my father's letters." His voice broke. "I remembered the woods, the little girl who led me home. I promised you I would marry you. I promised I would never let you be lost again. And I forgot. I forgot you, Seraphina. I broke that promise before I even knew who you were." Tears spilled down her cheeks, silent and unstoppable. She pressed her fingers to her lips, struggling to contain the sob that rose in her throat. "I kept it all these years. I thought if you ever remembered it would mean something. But you didn't remember. You didn't see me." "I see you now," he said, his own eyes burning. "And it terrifies me how close I came to losing you. I see the woman who has more grace and strength than anyone I have ever known. I see my wife. I see the girl who saved me. And I am begging you, give me a chance to become a man worthy of that promise." She closed her eyes, and the silence stretched. Outside, The wind stirred the leaves, and the distant sound of children's voices faded into the evening. "I stopped hopping," she whispered. "It hurt too much." "Then let me hope for both of us," he said, his voice raw. "Let me carry that hope until you're ready to share it. I will wait. I will earn it. I will spend every day of the rest of my life showing you that you are seen, and you are loved, and you will never be invisible again." Serafina opened her eyes and looked at him, really looked past the cold Duke, past the indifferent husband, to the boy in the woods who had made a promise and forgotten, and the man who had finally remembered. She saw the regret etched into every line of his face, the fear, the desperate, aching love he had only just discovered. She did not fall into his arms. She did not declare forgiveness, but she took the pendant from his hand and clasped it around her neck, the cool glass resting against her skin. "I will try," she said, her voice trembling but steady. "That is all I can offer." Kalen exhaled a breath he had not known he was holding. "That is more than I deserve." Over the following weeks, Thornwood Hall transformed. The cold, silent corridors filled with a tentative warmth. Kalen did not press her, he simply showed up. He visited the schoolroom, sitting quietly at the back while she taught, the children giggling at the sight of the stern Duke on a tiny stool. He accompanied her to the village clinic, carrying boxes of supplies, listening to her ideas for improvements with genuine attention. He began to learn her rhythms, her quiet habits, the way she took her tea, the books she loved. Serafina watched him warily at first, still guarding her heart. But slowly, inexorably, the ice within her began to thaw. She saw the effort, the humility, the way he struggled to express emotions he had locked away for years. She saw the man beneath the title. Dr. Wren noticed the change and, with a gentleman's grace, stepped back. He had never presumed, and Serafina's friendship with him remained a quiet, steady support, but the romantic tension dissolved into something platonic and safe. Kalen, to his credit, did not demand she sever ties. He understood trust must be rebuilt without ultimatums. One evening, as autumn turned the leaves to copper and gold, they walked together in the garden. Serafina paused by the rose bushes she had been pruning months before, now blooming with late-season flowers. Kalen stopped beside her. "You've made this place beautiful again," he said, gesturing to the garden. "It always had the potential," she replied, a hint of a smile touching her lips. "It just needed someone to care." He turned to her, and his gray eyes held a vulnerability that would have been unimaginable a year ago. "I was a barren ground, Serafina. You planted seeds in me without even knowing, and now I'm terrified of losing the garden you've become." She looked up at him, and something shifted in the air between them. "You're not losing me, Kalen. I'm still here." He reached up and gently touched the forget-me-not pendant resting at her collarbone. "I want to make a new promise," he said softly. "Not a boy's promise in the woods, but a man's promise in a garden. I promise to see you, every day. I promise to listen. I promise to cherish the gift you've given me by staying. I will never again take your presence for granted." Serafina felt the last of her resistance slip away. She had been strong for so long, bracing against heartbreak, that allowing herself to trust again felt like stepping off a precipice. But the way he looked at her, with such raw, unguarded hope, gave her the courage to fall. "I believe you," she whispered. He leaned down and pressed his lips to her forehead, a gesture so tender it brought fresh tears to her eyes. It was not a passionate kiss. It was a promise sealed with reverence. And for the first time in her life, Serafina felt truly cherished. Winter arrived, and with it, a quiet contentment settled over Thornwood Hall. The tenants spoke of the Duke's transformation, how he now walked among them with his wife. How he seemed lighter, how her Grace's laughter could be heard drifting from the windows on crisp evenings. The schoolroom thrived, the clinic expanded, and Serafina's reputation as a compassionate benefactress spread through the county. But the deepest healing happened in the small, unremarkable moments. The way Kalen would reach for her hand under the dinner table, The way he would leave her notes in books he thought she might enjoy. The way he would sit beside the hearth and simply listen while she read aloud, his eyes soft and unguarded. One night, a fierce storm swept across the estate, rattling the windows and howling through the chimneys. Serafina woke to find Kaelin standing at the foot of her bed, a candle in his hand. "I couldn't sleep," he admitted. "The storm, I kept thinking of you alone in the woods when we were children. I couldn't bear the thought of you being frightened now." She smiled sleepily and shifted aside, inviting him to sit. He placed the candle on the nightstand and lowered himself onto the edge of the bed. They did not speak. They simply remained together, listening to the wind, and in the quiet, the last shadows of the past year faded. Spring came, and with it, the anniversary of their wedding. Kaelin planned no grand celebration. Instead, he took Serafina to the woods where they had first met. The forget-me-nots were in bloom, a carpet of tiny blue stars stretching beneath the ancient trees. He knelt among them, heedless of the dirt on his fine trousers, and took her hand. "I brought you here because this is where it began," he said. "The promise I broke and the promise I intend to keep. I love you, Serafina. I love you with a depth I didn't know I possessed. You taught me what love is by living it, even when I gave you nothing. You are the center of my world." She knelt across from him, her gown pooling in the flowers. "I loved you too late," she said softly, but then corrected herself. "No, I loved you always. It was you who loved me late, but late love is still love, and I will not turn it away." Kaelin lifted her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. "I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret that." They sat together in the glade, surrounded by the blue blossoms, the past finally laid to rest. The journey had been long and painful: pain, hope, distance, jealousy, regret, fear of loss, confession, and now, at last, healing. Not a perfect healing, for scars remained, but a healing nonetheless. A love that had been forged in loneliness and tempered by grace. As the sun dipped below the canopy, Serafina rested her head on Kaelin's shoulder. She thought of the lonely woman at the window, watching a black horse disappear. She thought of the empty rooms and the cold glances. And she realized that all of it, every tear and every ache, had led her here. Not to a fairy tale, but to something real. A partnership built on mutual respect, on forgiveness, on the quiet miracle of two broken people choosing to become whole together. And for the first time in her life, the Duchess of Thornwood was not invisible. She was seen. She was loved. She was home.